The only time Maren Whitfield did not listen to her husband was the autumn he died. 3 weeks before the fever took him, Edmund sat at the kitchen table with the land deed spread open between them and said quietly, the way he said everything, that maybe it was time to consider selling. 40 acres of limestone hillside in Hollow Creek, Kentucky, too steep to plow properly, too rocky to graze more than a handful of animals, too far from the creek for reliable irrigation. He had bought it with every penny they had saved in 4 years of marriage, and he had spent 3 years learning slowly and painfully that the land did not want to be farmed. Maren told him no. She did not say it cruelly. She said it the way she said most things, which was directly and without decoration. She said the land was theirs and that meant something, and that winter would be hard. But they had made it through hard winters before, and that come spring, they would try again. Edmund looked at her across the table for a long moment. Then he folded the deed, put it back in the tin box where they kept their important papers, and never mentioned selling again. 3 weeks later, he was gone. The fever came fast, the way fevers did in 1846, without warning and without mercy. On a Tuesday, he was weak. By Thursday, he could not stand. By the following Monday, Maren was digging a grave in the rocky hillside soil she had refused to let him sell alone because there was no one else to do it. She thought about that conversation every single day that followed, not with guilt exactly, or not only with guilt. She thought about it the way you think about a road you chose at a fork, knowing you can never go back to see where the other road led. Edmund had been a gentle man, a reasonable man, a man who looked at the world as it actually was, rather than as he wished it to be. When he said the land was too poor, he was right. He had been right about most things. And she had overruled him with nothing more than stubbornness and a feeling in her chest that she could not quite name something that said, "This place is yours, hold on to it," even when every practical consideration said otherwise. Now she was 26 years old, alone on 40 acres of failing land, with a Kentucky winter gathering itself on the horizon like a fist. She was not from Kentucky. That was the first thing people in Hollow Creek had decided about her, and it was the thing they returned to whenever they needed to explain her. She had come from a small town in Virginia, the daughter of a blacksmith, which meant she knew how to work with her hands and how to be underestimated by people who judged a woman by the softness of her palms. Her palms were not soft. They had not been soft since she was 12 years old and started working the bellows for her father, and they were certainly not soft now after 3 years of trying to coax crops from limestone hillside. The women of Hollow Creek had been kind to her in the careful, measured way of people who are kind to someone they expect to leave soon. The men had been respectful in the way men are respectful to another man's wife when that man is present. Now Edmund was not present, and the respect had a different quality to it. Thinner, more conditional, like something that could be withdrawn. The first person to test that withdrawal was Judge Harlan Voss. He was 58 years old, heavy-set with gray at his temples and the particular confidence of a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything important, or at least had never been forced to reckon with it. He was the magistrate for Hollow Creek and 3 surrounding counties, which meant he was the closest thing to law that most people in the valley would ever encounter. He wore good boots and kept his horse well fed and smiled with the warmth of a man who wanted you to believe the warmth was genuine. Maren first saw him at the cemetery. She was standing beside the fresh mound of Edmund's grave, still holding the shovel, because she had not yet decided what to do with herself now that the digging was finished, when she noticed Voss at the edge of the tree line. He was not with the small group of neighbors who had come to pay their respects. He was separate from them, hat in hand, face composed in the expression of a man attending to a professional obligation. He waited until the last of the neighbors had gone, and then he walked toward her with the unhurried gait of someone who understood that time was on his side. Behind him, parked on the dirt road at the edge of the cemetery, was a dark wagon, and through the window of that wagon, a woman was watching. Maren noticed her the way you notice something that does not quite fit. The woman was perhaps 36, well-dressed in the practical way of a prosperous household, and she was looking at Maren with an expression that was neither sympathetic nor cold. It was something harder to name. It was the expression of a person watching something happen that they know they cannot stop. Then Voss was in front of her, and Marin stopped looking at the wagon. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I'm sorry for your loss. Edmund was a decent man." Marin said. "I want to speak plainly with you if I may. I know the timing is poor. Then perhaps you could wait." "I'm afraid the timing, poor as it is somewhat relevant." He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. Not the land deed. Something official, looking with a county seal. "I've been watching the Whitfield property for some time now. As a matter of professional concern, you understand. 40 acres in this county, not under productive cultivation with no male head of household to manage it, raises certain questions under the property management statutes." Marin looked at the paper. She did not take it. $200, Voss said. "For the whole parcel. That's a fair price for land in that condition." "That land is my home." "Mrs. Whitfield, you have no children, no family within 200 miles, and no means to work that property alone. Winter is coming. I'm offering you a way out of a situation that is going to become very difficult very quickly." "I heard you the first time," Marin said. "The answer is no." Something moved in Voss's expression. Not anger, something more patient than anger. "Then we'll speak again in the spring," he said, "if circumstances allow." He turned back toward his wagon, and Marin, without quite deciding to, looked again at the woman in the window. For just a moment their eyes met. The woman did not look away. She held Marin's gaze for 2 or 3 seconds with those unreadable eyes, and then the wagon was turning, and she was gone, and Marin was alone in the cemetery with a shovel and a fresh grave and 40 acres of rocky hillside that she had refused to let her husband sell. She stood there for a long time after the wagon disappeared. The weeks that followed had a particular quality that Marin would later struggle to describe. Not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. More like the feeling of standing in a room where all the furniture has been removed. The shapes of things were still there, still familiar, but the substance was gone. She rose before dawn because Edmund had risen before dawn. She made 2 cups of coffee before remembering each morning that there was only one of her. She spoke to him sometimes in the evenings when the silence of the house became too specific to bear. She did not speak to many other people. The community of Hollow Creek was small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, and Marin's business was currently the subject of considerable interest. She could feel it at the general store, in the slight pause before the storekeeper's wife asked how she was managing. She could feel it at church in the way conversation shifted when she came within earshot. People were kind. People were also waiting to see what would happen to her with the particular anticipatory interest that attaches to any situation that seems likely to resolve itself dramatically one way or another. The dramatic resolution most of them were expecting was for Marin Whitfield to sell the land and leave. Reverend Silas Pruitt was the one who said it out loud. He was 52, thin-shouldered, with pale eyes that had a quality of seeing through things to some deeper principle beneath. He was not a cruel man. Marin had never thought of him as a cruel man. He was a man of genuine conviction who had simply never been forced to examine whether his convictions were correct, which is a different thing and in some ways more dangerous. The Sunday after Edmund's burial, he preached from Proverbs about the wise woman who builds her house and the foolish one who tears it down with her own hands. He did not look at Marin once during the entire sermon. The congregation looked at Marin twice as much as usual, which amounted to the same thing. After the service, he found her on the church steps. "Marin," he said with the particular gentleness of a man about to say something he knows will not land gently, "have you considered the possibility that God is offering you a way out of a situation you cannot manage alone? The Caldwell family needs help through the winter. Room and board in exchange for cooking and childcare. There's no shame in it." Marin looked at him steadily. "Reverend Pruitt, my husband, spent 4 years of his life to buy that land. He died on it. I will not trade it for room and board. That land cannot support a single woman. Then it will learn to." She stepped down off the church steps. "I appreciate your concern." She walked back to her horse, and as she untied the reins, she was aware of a figure at the corner of the church building. A boy of about 17, lean and loose-jointed, watching her with the undisguised interest of someone who has not yet learned to pretend he is not watching. She knew who he was, Tommy Greer, youngest son of Eli Greer, whose farm shared a property line with hers on the eastern side. Tommy had a reputation in the valley as a boy who broke things not always accidentally. He caught her looking and grinned. Not a friendly grin, the grin of someone who has decided he finds a situation entertaining. Marin did not grin back. She rode home. That night, she found her fence broken. The post on the eastern side, the one that bordered the Greer property, had been pulled from the ground and laid aside with the deliberateness of someone making a point, rather than the carelessness of wind or weather. Her cow, a brown and white animal named by Edmund, in a moment of sentimentality that Marin had privately found endearing, was gone. She stood at the broken fence in the early dark with a lantern, looking at the gap, and felt something shift in her chest from grief to anger. Anger was cleaner than grief. Anger had a direction. She did not go looking for the cow that night. The woods were dark, and the ground was frozen, and she was not going to stumble through brush in the dark to prove a point to a 17-year-old boy who had not yet learned that women who are trying to survive don't have time to chase people who make things harder for them. She would deal with Tommy Greer. But not tonight. Tonight, she had something else to do. She had been putting it off for 3 days, telling herself she was being practical, that she had more pressing concerns, that there was no point in going back down into the root cellar until she had a specific reason. But the truth, which she had not quite admitted to herself until she was standing at the broken fence with the cold working through her coat, was that she was a little afraid, not of the dark. Marin had never been particularly afraid of the dark. She was afraid of what she might find, or more precisely, of what she might not find. She had made a small, private decision in the moment she first saw those stairs, and she was aware that the wrong outcome would require her to unmake that decision, and she did not know if she had the reserves left for that. She went anyway. The root cellar was older than the cabin, older than any record of the farm's existence, carved into the limestone hillside by hands that had worked before anyone in Hollow Creek was keeping track. Marin had been down there 100 times. She knew its smell, its temperature, the way the air sat different underground than it did above. Edmund had kept the vegetables there and the preserves in the small, fragile hope of making it to spring. She moved the bins aside, all of them this time, not just the ones she normally moved. She moved them with deliberate thoroughness, the way you move things when you are no longer willing to leave any corner unexamined. The gap was still there. She had half expected it to be gone, to turn out to have been a trick of lantern light or exhaustion. But the stairs were real, as solid and deliberate as they had been the first time she saw them. Stone steps cut into the living rock, worn smooth by what must have been generations of feet. Not rough stone shelves, but something shaped, something that had been made with intention. She sat at the edge for a moment. She thought about Edmund, about the one conversation she had had with him about this cellar, a throwaway remark 2 winters ago. Strange thing, he had said, not looking up from his boot he was mending. Cellar's warmer than it ought to be. Must be something about the rock around here. Then he had gone back to the boot, and Marin had thought nothing of it, and the bins had gone back against the wall, and the moment had passed. He had been standing at the edge of something extraordinary, and had filed it under the category of curious local geology and moved on. Marin picked up her lantern and walked down. She counted the steps because she needed something to do with her mind. 17, 18, 19. The air changed at around step 25, becoming warmer and carrying a quality she could not name, something mineral and old and utterly still. By step 40, she could feel warmth through her coat. By step 50, she had unbuttoned it. By step 64, she stepped off the last stair and into a space that knocked the breath from her body. The cavern was enormous. Her lantern pushed light outward and found only darkness at the edges, the walls too far away to illuminate. The ceiling arched overhead in a shape she associated with the cathedrals, though she had only ever seen pictures of cathedrals. The floor was flat and covered with a fine layer of dust, well in uniform, the kind of dust that accumulates over decades in absolute stillness. Here is the essential fact stated: once limestone formations at sufficient depth maintain a constant temperature through geothermal stability, the heat of the earth itself radiating steadily upward through the rock, regardless of what the weather above is doing. The cave under the Whitfield property held 55 degrees year-round. Not cold, not warm enough to be comfortable without a coat on a normal day, but warm enough in winter to be the difference between living and not living. She held out her free hand and pressed it flat against the limestone wall. The stone was warm under her palm, steady, present, as if it had been waiting at this exact temperature since long before she was born and would remain at this temperature long after she was gone. She stood there for a long time with her hand on the wall. Then she brought the lantern lower and looked at what surrounded her. The fire pits were the first thing she registered. 3 of them spaced across the cavern floor, their stone borders blackened to a depth that spoke of decades of use. The ashes inside were cold, but somehow gave the impression of being recent, as if the idea of warmth still lived in them. The sleeping platforms were next, carved directly into the walls at chest height, smoothed by what must have been generations of bodies resting in them. Not rough stone shelves, but something closer to shaped stone with a gentle curve that has suggested whoever made them had thought carefully about the shape of a human body at rest. And then in a small alcove no larger than a pantry, almost invisible, until she turned the lantern at exactly the right angle, a hollow in the wall. Inside it, resting on a small stone ledge, as if set there with care, a clay vessel no bigger than her fist sealed with beeswax. Beside it, set with equal deliberateness, a small pouch made of leather so old it had gone stiff and dark. Maren did not touch either of them. She looked at them for a long time, the lantern held steady, her breath making small clouds in the still air. Someone had put those objects in that alcove and walked away, not abandoned them. Set them there, arranged them, made certain they would be found by whoever came next. She thought whoever put these here expected someone to come. She thought that means this place was supposed to be found. She straightened up and looked around the cavern with new eyes, seeing it not as an accident of geology, but as a creation, a deliberate work, something made with purpose by people who understood both the land above and the land below. They had known about the warmth. They had known how to use it. They had built sleeping platforms and fire pits and storage alcoves and had kept their food here through winters that the land above could not survive, and then they had left. And they had left these things in the alcove like a message to whoever came next. Maren was 26 years old, newly widowed, with no money and no family, and a mocking 17-year-old boy pulling down her fences, and a magistrate with good boots waiting for her to fail. She had 40 acres of rocky hillside that could not be properly farmed, and a cabin whose roof was going to need work before the real cold hit. She had all of that, and she had this. She climbed back up the 64 stairs in the warm air and stood in the root cellar in the dark, breathing. Then she moved the bins back across the gap, arranged them exactly as they had been, and went up into the house. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table where Edmund had spread the land deed and said maybe it was time to consider selling, and she thought for a very long time. At some point before dawn, she made a decision. Not a grand decision, not a declaration, more like a reorganization of the facts she had available and an understanding that the land she had refused to let Edmund sell was worth more than either of them had known. Not because of anything that could be captured in a county deed or a land use statute, because of what was 64 stairs below it. She was still sitting at the table when she heard hooves on the road, and then a knock at the door, and then the sound of Judge Harlan Voss clearing his throat. She opened the door to find him on her porch with a folded piece of paper and an expression of careful, practiced reasonableness. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitfield. I hope I haven't come too early." "What is it?" He extended the paper. She took it this time. It was an official document from the county court citing a statute regarding land that had gone unfarmed for more than 2 seasons, land where there was no active household management land, that in the court's determination constituted a burden on the productive capacity of the county. "You have until the 1st of January, Voss said, to demonstrate that this property is being actively used. If you cannot do that, the court will schedule a hearing on the question of whether the land should be reassigned." Maren read the document twice. Her face was very still. "I have until January 1st, she said. "That's correct. I want to be clear that this is not a hostile action. It's a practical one. The county has an interest in—" "You'll have your demonstration," Maren said. She folded the document and held it at her side. Will that be all? Voss looked at her for a moment with those patient, calculating eyes. Then he glanced past her toward the root cellar door, and Marin had the brief, distinct impression that his attention on that door was not casual. That will be all, he said, for now. He turned toward on his horse. Marin watched him go, and as she watched, she saw something at the edge of the tree line that made her go very still. A woman, old, enormously old, with white hair that fell past her shoulders, and a stillness about her that was not the stillness of someone who had just arrived, but the stillness of someone who had been standing in that exact spot for quite some time. She was watching Voss right away with the expressionless patience of a stone watching weather. Then Voss was gone, and the old woman turned her eyes to Marin. They looked at each other across the frost-covered ground. Then the woman spoke, her voice carrying clearly despite the distance and the quiet. I know what you found. You haven't gone far enough. Marin opened her mouth to ask who she was, how she knew how long she had been standing there. But the woman turned back into the tree line, and within 3 steps, the forest had taken her as completely as if she had always been part of it. Marin stood on her porch with Voss's court document in her hand and the old woman's words in her ears, in the morning cold working through her dress, and she felt the shape of something she could not yet name, something larger than a root cellar, and wider than 40 acres and older than any deed in any tin box. She went inside. She put the document on the table beside the deed. She looked at both of them for a moment. Then she started planning. She came back 3 days later, not Agnes. Marin went back down the stairs the very next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Each time she went a little further. Each time she found more. The cavern off the main stairs opened into a passage at its eastern wall, low-ceilinged and narrow for the first 20 feet, before it widened into a second chamber, smaller than the first, but warmer further from the surface. The stone walls holding heat the way cast iron holds heat evenly and without complaint. Beyond that was a third space. She could only see the edge of the lantern light failing before it reached the far wall. On the third morning, she found the underground stream. It announced itself as sound before sight, a steady, low conversation of water over stone, coming from a passage she had thought was a dead end. She had to turn sideways to get through the gap in the rock. And then the passage opened, and there it was, a stream perhaps 4 feet wide, running over a flat limestone bed. The water so clear she could see every stone on the bottom moving at a walking pace with the unhurried certainty of something that had been flowing since before the hillside. Above it had a name. She knelt and put her hand in. The water was the same temperature as the air, carrying the same steady warmth up from the deep earth. Not river cold the way water in January should have been. She drank from her cupped hand. The water tasted of mineral and depth and time. It was on that third morning, coming back up through the root cellar, with her coat unbuttoned and her mind already working the problem of how many sleeping platforms existed and how much food she could reasonably store below, that she found Agnes Morrow sitting on the edge of the stone step at the top of the stairs waiting. Agnes did not look like someone who had been waiting. She looked like someone who had arrived precisely when she intended to. She was older than anyone Marin had ever seen. 93 years had done to her face what water does to stone over centuries, not destroyed it, but shaped it into something elemental. All unnecessary softness gone, what remained, being exactly what had always been most essential. Her white hair hung loose past her shoulders. Her hands resting on her knees were the hands of someone who had done a great deal of work over a very long period of time. Her eyes were dark and fully present in the way of someone who has outlived most of the things they ever feared. You found the water, Agnes said. It was not a question. How did you know? Because you came up with your coat open. The first time I found it, I did the same thing. Marin sat down on the step below her. They were eye level. You've been inside. My grandmother's grandmother built the first fire pit in the large chamber. My mother was born in the small chamber to the east. I came here as a child before. She did not say before what. She did not need to. The word carried everything it needed to carry. I have not been inside since I was 5 years old, and 88 years, Marin said. 88, Agnes agreed. She looked past her down the stairs. The stairs were here before your people came, before anyone in this county was counting years the way you count them now. My people called this place the Winter Heart because it held warmth when everything above was killing cold. Her eyes came back to Marin. You found the alcove. The clay vessel, I didn't touch it. Something shifted in Agnes's face, not surprise. Something older than surprise. The pouch beside it belonged to my sister. She was 3 years old when we were made to leave. My mother put it there to be kept safe until we came back. She was quiet for a moment. We did not come back. Marin did not say she was sorry. She had learned in the weeks since Edmund's death that sorry was often the smallest coin you could offer someone and still feel like you had paid something. Instead, she said, I'll take you down if you want. Agnes looked at her steadily for a long moment. Then she stood with the careful deliberateness of someone who has long since made her peace with what her body will and will not do, and said, show me what you found that I haven't seen. They went down together. Agnes moved through the main chamber with her hands trailing the wall, her fingers reading the surface in a way that was not exploratory but confirmatory, checking that what she remembered was still there. She paused at the fire pits. She stood for a long time at the alcove, her hand resting on the clay vessel, without picking it up, her face doing something private that Marin looked away from. Then she led Marin to a section of the eastern wall that Marin had examined and dismissed as featureless, and pressed her palm flat against a particular spot, and the lantern light caught what had been invisible before carved lines, thin and precise, the kind made by someone who had time and patience and a clear intention. Not decoration. A map. Marin leaned in close. The lines showed chambers, passages, the stream, two entrances she had not found. One appeared to be a sinkhole half a mile from the house. The other was behind something she could not quite parse from the carving, a shape that might have been falling water. The waterfall above Breaker Creek, Agnes said. In summer, it's easy to find. In winter, it freezes over on the outside, but not the inside. There's a passage behind it wide enough for a person. 3 entrances, Marin said. 4. The 4th is collapsed. Has been since before I was born. Agnes traced one of the carved lines with her finger. The chambers go further than this map shows. The people who made this map did not finish it. The winter came before they could. Marin straightened and looked at the map and then at the woman beside her, and understood in a way she hadn't fully until this moment the scale of what she was standing in. This was not a geological curiosity. It was not simply a convenient shelter. It was infrastructure. It was the work of generations of people who had looked at the problem of winter and solved it not by fighting the cold above, but by stepping below it, who had carved and mapped and stored and planned with the patient intelligence of people who understood that the same emergency would come again and again and again, and that the answer was always to go deeper. How many people, Marin asked? Agnes understood the question immediately. The winter of 1780, my grandmother said there were more than 60 different families, some of them not our people. She paused. She said they ate together, told stories to each other's children. One of the old men died down here, and they buried him in the alcove at the back of the 3rd chamber, and the people who were not our people helped carry the stones. She looked at Marin. You're not asking how many the chambers can hold. I'm asking how many I might need to hold. That, Agnes said, is the right question. They climbed back up in the late afternoon light, and Agnes sat at Marin's kitchen table and drank coffee and taught Marin over the next 2 hours everything her grandmother had told her and her mother had confirmed and her own 5-year-old memory had retained. Which chamber stayed warmest, which passages were stable, and which had questionable ceilings, where the stream was safest to drink from and where it ran too fast to be reliable. How the smoke channels had been designed so that a fire below would exhaust itself through the natural fractures in the rock without showing above. That last detail stopped Marin cold. Fires down there don't show smoke above, not if you use them in the right chambers. The people who built this were not careless. Agnes set down her cup. They had reasons not to want people above to know they were below. Marin thought about that for a moment. Then she thought about Judge Harlan Voss and his good boots and his court documents and the way his eyes had moved to the root cellar door. Agnes, she said carefully, how long have you known this was here? Since I was a child. And you've been in this valley for how long? I came back 11 years ago. I have been watching this farm for 11 years. She met Marin's eyes without apology. I watched your husband dig his garden in the wrong place for 2 springs before I understood he didn't know what was below. I watched him put those bins against the wall. You could have told him. It was not time. And now it's time. Agnes looked at her with those fully present eyes and said, now you found it yourself. That's different. Things you find yourself, you understand differently than things you are given. Agnes left before dark. Marin sat at the table after she was gone and did not move for a long time. Then she got up, put on her coat, and went to the barn to begin an inventory of everything she had that could be moved underground and kept dry. She worked by lantern until past midnight. The next morning, Nora Voss appeared at her gate. She was alone. No wagon, no horse that Marin could see, which meant she had walked, which meant she had not wanted anyone to know that she was coming. She stood at the fence post with a traveling cloak pulled close against the November wind, and when Marin came out onto the porch, she said without preamble or social softening, my husband knows there's a cave under this land. Marin kept her face still. What makes you say that? Because his father knew. 22 years ago, before your husband bought this property, Harlan's father tried to buy it from the previous owner. He had found one of the entrances up near the sinkhole on the north end of your property, but a section of the passage had collapsed, and he couldn't get through. He knew the cave was there, but couldn't access it. He told Harlan about it before he died. Nora's voice was even almost clinical, the voice of someone who has been organizing a difficult body of information for a long time and is finally releasing it. That's why Harlan has wanted this land for 20 years, not the limestone, the cave. He said limestone. He says what's useful. A pause. He's contacted someone in Frankfurt, a land use attorney. He's looking at whether a cave system, if it can be classified as a mineral resource, falls under different statutes than surface property, whether a landowner's rights extend downward and how far. She looked at Marin steadily. If he can establish that the cave is a separate mineral asset from the land above it, your deed means nothing. You could win his court challenge on the surface and still lose everything below. The cold had a different quality now. Marin felt it even though she was standing on a porch and had a coat on. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Nora was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the bare branches above them. In 1839, she said there was a family named Harrison, south end of the county. Harlan wanted their water rights. He found a way to classify their creek frontage as a navigable waterway under state jurisdiction. They lost the water rights to the county, lost their farm within 2 years without water. She paused again. I knew what he was doing when he was doing it. I said nothing. She reached into her cloak and produced a folded piece of paper creased with the care of something that had been handled many times. She held it out and Marin took it. It was a letter handwritten addressed to an attorney in Frankfurt. The handwriting was Voss's. I copied it, Nora said simply. He keeps his correspondence in the left drawer of his desk. He doesn't lock it because he doesn't believe I read. Marin looked at the letter. It was careful and precise and contained the phrase, mineral asset subterranean, with the ease of someone who had been thinking about this legal argument for some time. I need witnesses, Marin said, people from this community who have been inside the cave, who can testify that it's integral to the functioning of the property, not a separate mineral deposit. Yes, Nora said. Voss will contest anything you say. You're his wife. I know, but I can make sure the right people know what he's doing, and I can testify to his intent, even if they discount the testimony. She looked at Marin with the steadiness of someone who has made a decision they cannot unmake. Who else have you thought of? Marin thought of Reverend Pruitt and his pale eyes and his certainty that she needed to go be someone's cook. She thought of what he represented in this county, a man of God, a man the court in Frankfurt would find credible. Pruitt, she said. Something moved in Nora's expression that might have been doubt. He doesn't think well of your situation. He thinks well of what's right. Those aren't always the same thing, but sometimes they are. Marin folded the letter and held it. I'll talk to him. Nora buttoned the top of her cloak. Be careful how you approach it. He'll resist anything that feels like he's being recruited to a cause. He'll respond to something he can witness for himself. Then she turned and walked back down the road the way she had come, not hurrying her back straight in the cold morning, and Marin watched her go and thought about what it cost a person to do what Nora Voss had just done. She went to see Pruitt that afternoon. She found him in the small room behind the nave that served as his study, surrounded by his sermon notes and a worn Bible, and the smell of wood smoke and old paper. He looked up when she came in with the expression of a man preparing to be reasonable. She put Nora's copy of the letter on his desk without speaking. He read it. His face changed slowly the way ice changes in early spring, the surface holding its shape while the structure underneath begins to shift. "This is real," he said, copied from the original in Voss's desk by his wife. His wife. "She walked to my house this morning to give it to me, alone, without telling him." Pruitt set the letter down. He looked at it for a moment. "What does he think is under your land?" "A cave system. He's right that it exists." She paused. "I want you to see it." He looked up at her. "You're asking me to come to your property. I'm asking you to come underground, so that when you make a statement before any court or county official about the nature of that property, you're making it as someone who has been there." Pruitt was quiet for a long moment. The fire in the small grate popped and settled. He looked at the letter again, then at Marin, and she could see him turning something over, measuring it against a framework he had spent 50 years building. "Tomorrow morning," he said. He arrived before 8, dressed, practically carrying his own lantern, as if he had been expecting to need it. He followed Marin into the root cellar without speaking, watched her move the bins aside without comment, and looked at the stairs with an expression she could not read. He followed her down all 64 steps in silence. When the passage opened into the main chamber, he stopped at the last step and stood there for nearly a full minute, holding his lantern up, turning it slowly to see as much as he could. The fire pits, the sleeping platforms, the carved map on the wall. He moved to the map and stood before it for a long time. Then he saw Agnes. She was sitting near the eastern passage in the way she sometimes sat, absolutely still, her hands in her lap, her eyes open. She had arrived sometime in the night, as she occasionally did, because she had told Marin once that she slept better down here than anywhere above. Pruitt and Agnes looked at each other across the chamber. Pruitt's lantern was between them, and in its light Marin could see both of their faces at once, the minister and the elder, two people who represented things that had not been kind to each other in this country, and probably would not have been kind to each other now in ordinary circumstances. But they were 64 stairs below ordinary circumstances in a place that had been built before anyone in either of their lineages had arrived in Kentucky, and something about that particular depth seemed to reset certain calculations. Pruitt lowered his lantern slightly in a gesture that was not quite a bow, but held some of the intention of one. Agnes said, "Sit down, preacher. The stone is clean." He sat. They stayed in the chamber for 2 hours. Pruitt asked Agnes questions with the careful respect of someone who is aware they are receiving something they have not earned. Agnes answered some of them and declined to answer others, which he accepted. At one point, she showed him the carved map, and he traced the lines with one finger and asked about the smoke channels, and she explained them, and he nodded slowly, not with the nod of someone learning a curiosity, but with the nod of someone who was revising a structure they thought was complete. When they came back up, standing in the gray November light outside the root cellar, Pruitt turned to Marin and said, "I'll write to the county court, and to Frankfurt if necessary. This cave is not a mineral deposit. It is a feature of the land indistinguishable from the land itself, as integral to this farm as the soil above it." He paused. "And I will say so to anyone who needs to hear it." Marin nodded. She did not thank him because he had not done it for her gratitude, and they both understood that. "There's one more thing," Pruitt said. He was looking at the root cellar door. "If this winter is as bad as the signs suggest, if people need shelter." He stopped. Then, "How many can it hold?" "More than this community has people," Marin said. He looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he put on his hat and walked to his horse. The first day of January came in quiet and deceivingly mild. Marin had spent every day of December moving things underground. She had built a cooking area beside the stream with flat stones Agnes helped her select. She had carried down enough food to sustain one person through an entire winter. She had made bedding from moss and dried grass and positioned it on the carved sleeping platforms. She had hauled down oil and candles and the good wool blanket from Edmund's side of the bed, which she folded and placed in the alcove beside the clay vessel. She worked without telling anyone because there was no one to tell. Tommy Greer had taken her cow and no one had returned it. She had gone out looking 3 days after the fence was broken, found the animal wandering the south pasture of the Greer property, and driven it quietly home before first light. No one saw, no one said anything. The matter was settled in the way of people who understand that some debts are better left uncollected until the right moment. On the 3rd of January, she went down into the cave in the evening to check the cooking fire and discovered that the temperature above had dropped enough that the warmth rising from the cave entrance was now visible, a faint breath of heat lifting from the open root cellar door into the still air above it. She stood at the root cellar entrance and looked up at the sky. The clouds were wrong. She had lived on this land for 3 years, and she had grown up in a place where weather came off the mountains, and she knew clouds. These clouds were the color and texture of iron moving from the north with a speed and uniformity that meant cold, real cold, not December cold, but January cold, the kind of cold that killed things. She went back inside. She sat at Edmund's table. She thought about the 64 steps in the sleeping platforms and the 2 months of food and the stream that never froze. She thought about Ruth Calloway, who had 3 children under 7, and a husband who traveled for work in a cabin on the low end of the valley where the coal pooled. She thought about Beatrice Hicks, 70 years old, living alone since her husband died with a wood supply that had looked thin the last time Marin passed her place. She had prepared for one person. She had prepared that well enough. The question that kept her at the table until nearly midnight was not whether the cave could hold more people. She already knew it could. The question was whether she was willing to become the person who opened the door and said, "Come in," because becoming that person meant accepting that the cave was no longer a private resource, but a public one. And once you became that person, you could not become any other kind. Edmund had been the kind of person who kept things for himself and his family, not from selfishness, but from the limited vision of someone who had always had to fight to keep anything at all. Marin had loved him for it and had also quietly spent 3 years chafing at it. She picked up her lantern. She went down and she opened the cooking fire to a size that would carry through the night, and she checked the sleeping platforms, and she filled the water vessels from the stream, and she made sure the path from the stairs to the main chamber was clear. Then she went back up, left the root cellar door standing open, and hung her lantern at the top of the stairs. The cold came before dawn. She felt it when she woke, the particular quality of silence that means the world is locked. She looked out her window and saw the creek already frozen, saw her breath clouding in the room despite the fire she had banked, saw the sky, the specific white of a sky that has done what it intended to do and will not be argued with. 25 below. She would not know the number for days. She only knew the feeling of it, which was the feeling of a door swinging shut on everything warm. She went down into the cave and sat beside the cooking fire and waited. On the 5th day of the freeze, a sound came from above. Footsteps in the root cellar, uncertain then stopping. Then a child's voice saying something she could not make out, and then Ruth Calloway appeared at the bottom of the stairs with her youngest child on her hip and 2 older ones clutching her coat. And the child on her hip had lips, the particular gray-blue that means a body has been cold for too long. Ruth looked at the fire. She looked at the warm air. Her youngest stopped shivering for the first time in 48 hours. Marin stood up. "There's room," she said. "Bring anyone who needs it." Ruth Calloway turned and went back up the stairs, and Marin heard her footsteps crossing the frozen ground above, moving away, and she sat back down by the fire and thought, that is the thing you cannot undo. Then she heard a different set of footsteps at the top of the stairs, heavier, deliberate, and Daniel Ashford came down into the light. He had been Edmund's nearest neighbor in age, the closest thing Edmund had to a friend in the valley, a man of 38, who had been widowed 2 years before and had gone very quiet afterward, the kind of quiet that fills the space a person leaves. He and Marin had exchanged perhaps 40 words in 3 years. He was carrying his own lantern in a canvas bag and looking around the chamber with the expression of a man taking inventory. "Ruth told me," he said. "How is it above bad, getting worse? 3 families on the low end have lost their livestock." He looked at the fire, at the stream, at the sleeping platforms. He looked at the carved map on the wall. He looked at everything with the same unhurried attention, and then he put his bag down and said, "Your cooking fire is positioned wrong. The draw isn't right. You're losing heat to the East Passage." Marin looked at him. "I can fix it," he said, "if you want." She gestured toward the fire. He set to work without further conversation, moving stones with a quiet efficiency that suggested he had thought about the problem more than a glance should allow. And Marin watched him for a moment and then went to the stairs to watch for whoever Ruth was bringing back. By nightfall, there were 19 people in the cave. By the end of the 7th day, there were 29. Pruitt arrived on the 8th day with 6 people from the church congregation and looked around the main chamber at the sleeping figures and the firelight and the children who had already begun exploring the passages and found Agnes sitting in her accustomed spot near the wall. And the two of them sat together for a while without much speech, which Marin thought was probably the most honest conversation either of them had managed in years. Tommy Greer came on the 10th day. He did not come with anyone. He came alone, appearing at the bottom of the stairs like he had materialized from the rock itself, and he stood looking around with an expression that contained several things at once, none of which he had any intention of explaining. Marin looked at him across the chamber. "Have you eaten today?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." He looked away. She went to the cooking area and filled a bowl from the pot and brought it to him and left it beside him without waiting to see if he took it. The food supply was the problem she had not solved and was not sure she could solve. She had planned for one. She had 34 people by the 13th day, which was not a rounding error, but a fundamental change in the equation, and she sat with the inventory by lantern light on the evening of that day and did the arithmetic without softening it. And the arithmetic said they had perhaps 8 days of food at current consumption before people started going without. She was still sitting with the inventory when Agnes settled beside her. 13 days left, Agnes said, looking at the numbers without being told what they were. 8 the way we're going. The people here have things too. They didn't come with nothing. Most of them came with their children. Whatever food they had, they ate before they got here. Agnes was quiet. Then, "There are others who haven't come yet. They will bring things." She paused. "And there is the passage behind the frozen falls." Marin looked at her. Before the freeze, the Greer family stored winter provisions near the base of the falls. "I have watched them do it for 7 years." She met Marin's eyes. "The passage is too narrow for most, but not for a boy with a reason." Marin looked across the chamber to where Tommy Greer was sitting with his empty bowl staring at nothing. She had not yet asked him for anything. She had given him food and left him alone and waited the way you wait with something that is still deciding whether to trust you. But 8 days was not a long time, and the arithmetic was what it was. She stood up, and then before she took a step toward Tommy, a new sound came from the stairs. Heavy footsteps, a single set slow with cold, and something that might have been the particular deliberateness of a man who has been holding out as long as he could and has finally run out of hold. Judge Harlan Voss appeared at the bottom of the 64th step. He stood there in his good coat, which was no longer quite so good after however many days he had been burning his furniture, and he looked around the chamber at everything Marin had built in the place he had been trying to take from her, and his face went through several things before it settled into something she had not seen on it before. Not calculation, not the patient confidence of a man who believes time is on his side. Something older and quieter and considerably less comfortable. He found Marin in the crowd and their eyes met. "You said I'd be dead by spring," she said. Voss looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Nora sitting near the eastern passage, who did not look back at him. He looked at Pruitt, who met his gaze without expression. He looked at Agnes, who looked through him, the way stone looks through weather. "I was wrong," he said. Marin held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she stepped aside and gestured toward the warmth of the main chamber. "Come in," she said, "and there's room." Voss walked past her into the light, and as he passed, he reached into his coat and took out a folded piece of paper, and for one moment, Marin thought it was another court document, another legal instrument, another move in the long game of a man who thought in terms of statutes and property lines. But he held it over the cooking fire without unfolding it, and the paper caught and burned, and he let the ash fall into the fire and did not watch it go. He found a space against the far wall and sat down on the stone floor in his good ruined coat and did not speak to anyone, and after a while the cave went on around him the way the cave went on around everything warm and steady and entirely indifferent to the categories of men. Marin watched him for a moment. Then she went to find Tommy Greer because she had 8 days of food in a frozen waterfall and a passage that needed a boy with a reason. Tommy Greer came back 4 hours after he left, which was 3 hours and 50 minutes longer than Marin had allowed herself to expect him back at all. She heard him before she saw him, the scrape of boots on stone in the narrow passage that connected to the fall's entrance, a sound she had not heard from that direction before, because no one had used that passage since Agnes showed it to her on the carved map. Then Tommy appeared in the eastern opening, with a canvas sack over each shoulder and a third dragging behind him, and his coat was soaked through on one side where he had pressed himself through the gap behind the ice. And there was a cut above his left eye from the rock that he was ignoring, with the deliberateness of a boy who will not acknowledge pain in front of an audience. He dropped all 3 sacks in the center of the chamber without ceremony. "Potatoes," he said, "and dried beans, and 2 jars of my mother's apple preserves." He looked at Marin with an expression that dared her to say anything about whose potatoes they were or whose preserves. "My father's at the Voss house. He's fine." Marin looked at the sacks. She looked at the cut above his eye. She looked at his soaked coat. "Hang your coat by the fire," she said. "Eat something." Tommy sat down and did not hang his coat by the fire, but he accepted the bowl that Ruth Calloway brought him without the performance of not wanting it, which Marin counted as progress. What Tommy had bought them 6 more days, which meant when she redid the arithmetic that night that they had enough if the freeze broke within 2 weeks. The question was whether the freeze would cooperate with the arithmetic, and weather in Kentucky in January had never shown much interest in human arithmetic. She was thinking about this by the stream in the quiet hour after most of the cave had gone to sleep, when she became aware that she was not alone. Daniel Ashford had sat down on the flat stone across the water from her, close enough to talk quietly without waking anyone, far enough to have come there with intention rather than accident. They had not spoken much since he fixed the cooking fire. Not because of anything between them, but because the cave had a way of organizing people into tasks that kept them moving, and Daniel had become the person who managed the practical infrastructure of 34 people living underground, checking the cooking fire every 4 hours, monitoring the passages for anything that sounded wrong, learning the cave's architecture with the methodical attention of a man who has always expressed care through maintenance rather than words. "You're doing the food count again," he said. "It's better than sleeping." "Is it?" She looked at him across the stream. "You don't sleep much either." 2 years of not sleeping. You get used to the arithmetic." He paused. "Sarah died in February. The cold always gets me thinking in February." Marin had known Daniel's wife had died. She had not known her name until this moment, and the specific weight of a name is a different thing from the general knowledge of a loss. "Edmund died in October," she said. "The harvest time gets me." They sat for a while with the stream moving between them, steady and unhurried. The fire in the main chamber gave enough light to see by orange and low the way firelight looks in the deep part of the night when everyone who tends it has gone to sleep. "He knew this place was here," Daniel said. It was not a question. "He felt the warmth once, filed it away." "That sounds like Edmund." "Yes," Marin said, "it does." She had not talked about Edmund to anyone in the cave. She had not talked about Edmund to anyone at all since the cemetery where she had talked to his grave. Something about saying his name to Daniel, who had known him and was still alive, made the grief move differently than it usually moved, less like a wall she was walking into and more like water she was moving through. "He would have liked being right about the land," she said. "He didn't know he was right." "No, but he was." She looked at the stream. "He kept saying the land would work out. I thought he was being optimistic. He was just looking at the wrong part of it. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, do you think he knew some part of him? Myron thought about the land deed spread on the table, the way Edmund had folded it and put it back in the tin box and never mentioned selling again after she said no. As if at some level below conscious knowledge, he had been waiting for her to be the stubborn one, so he would not have to be. Maybe, she said, maybe he just trusted that there was more to it than what he could see. She was not sure she was still talking about the land. She was not sure Daniel was sure either, but neither of them said anything more about it. And after a while, the silence between them changed quality, became something comfortable rather than careful. And Marin realized she had not sat in comfortable silence with anyone for 4 months. She went to sleep eventually on the platform she had claimed in the smaller eastern chamber, and she slept without dreaming for the first time since October. The community that formed in those underground weeks was not the community that existed above. Above, people sorted themselves by property and standing in the old territories of who owed whom and who had spoken poorly of whose wife and whose land bordered whose at a contested angle. Below, they sorted themselves by usefulness. Ruth Calloway ran the cooking because she was good at it and because organizing the feeding of 34 people gave her somewhere to put the fear she was still carrying about her husband, who had not yet returned from his wood-gathering trip, and who no one mentioned because everyone understood that mentioning him would require acknowledging the possibility that the cold had answered a question no one wanted answered. Mr. Marsh, 60 years old and barely able to walk from what he called his bad knee, sat with the children every evening and told stories. Not Bible stories, not the moral instruction of a man performing a role, but stories from his own life, from his father's life, from the lives of people who had moved through this county before most of the children's parents were born. The children listened to him with the complete attention that children give to things that are genuinely interesting rather than things they have been instructed to find important. Beatrice Hicks, 70 years old, had turned out to know more about medicinal plants than Marin had suspected anyone in Hollow Creek knew. 2 of the children developed coughs in the 3rd week, the damp working into their chests, and Beatrice made something from dried plants she had brought in her coat pocket, and the cough subsided. Marin did not ask what was in it. Beatrice did not explain. Both of them understood that some knowledge is best respected without interrogation. Voss worked. This was the thing that no one had expected and no one mentioned directly because mentioning it would require acknowledging that they had expected something else. He had arrived with nothing useful in the history of a man who took rather than gave, and he had sat against the far wall for most of the first day, doing nothing. And then on the second morning, he had quietly begun helping Beatrice Hicks move between the sleeping platforms because she was 70 and the stone floor was difficult for her, and no one else had noticed or had made themselves notice. After that, he was simply part of the machinery of the cave, doing whatever needed doing without attaching his name to it. He carried water. He helped Tommy with a second run through the Falls Passage when it became clear that the first run's provisions would not stretch far enough. He sat with an elderly man named Silas Haddon, who was failing quietly in the corner of the second chamber, not from the cold, but from the weight of his years, and he sat there for long hours without speaking, which was what Silas needed. Marin watched him. She watched him the way you watch something you have categorized incorrectly and need to recategorize, not with warmth, yet not with forgiveness, but with the intellectual honesty that requires you to update your accounting when new information arrives. Nora watched him too, from across the cave with the expression of a woman who is learning something about her husband that she does not know how to hold alongside everything else she already knows about him. Marin saw her watching once and their eyes met, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that would not reduce something complicated to something simple, and the complicated thing deserved to stay complicated. It was on the 19th day that Pruitt sought out Agnes. Marin did not plan to witness it and tried afterward to determine whether she had intruded by staying, and concluded that she had not, because neither of them appeared to mind her presence, or perhaps because they both existed in the cave at a level of depth that made the usual social calculus of privacy and intrusion irrelevant. Pruitt had come to the room with the carved wall the room where the map was and where the fire pits were oldest, and the ceiling was lowest, and the air was stillest. Agnes was there as she sometimes was sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of the section of wall that held the oldest carvings, the ones whose meaning Marin had never been able to parse. Pruitt sat down beside her. He looked at the wall for a while. Then he said, "What does it say?" Agnes looked at the carvings. "It is a list of winners, how cold each one was, how many people came down, how many went back up." Pruitt was quiet. "How many didn't go back up?" "Fewer than would have died above." She paused. "Not none." Another silence. The fire pit between them cold for centuries, still holding the black memory of heat. "I preached for 30 years," Pruitt said, "about the importance of building on solid ground. I meant it as a metaphor." He looked at the fire pit. "I was wrong about what solid ground is." Agnes turned to look at him fully for the first time in the conversation. "What do you think it is now?" "I think it's whatever has been here long enough to have proven it stays." He said it slowly, like a man reading something he is translating as he goes. "Not what looks permanent, what is permanent." Agnes looked at him for a long moment with those eyes that had seen 88 years of things she had not been able to change. Then she said, "You will write your letter to Frankfurt." "I already wrote it. Sent it before the freeze came." He paused. "I told them the cave is not separable from the land, that it is the land continuing downward. I cited 3 precedents." He almost smiled. "I was a lawyer before I was a minister. People forget that." Agnes said nothing, but something in her face acknowledged it the way the ground acknowledges rain. On the 22nd day, Tommy came back from one of his surface checks and reported that the creek was moving again. Just barely at the center, a dark thread of open water in the middle of the ice, but moving. By the morning of the 23rd day, the temperature above had risen enough that the breath of the cave entrance was no longer visible against the outside air, because the outside air was no longer cold enough to show the difference. Marin climbed the 64 stairs and stood in the root cellar and opened the door to the surface and felt real sunlight on her face for the first time since January 3rd. It had the quality of something given back that you had not been certain would be given back. She stood there for a while. Then she went back down and said, "The freeze is over." People began gathering their things with the particular energy of people who have been in one place for a long time and are suddenly aware of it, the cramped muscles of patience releasing all at once. There was a great deal of movement and noise, children who had been sleeping for hours suddenly awake and urgent, the quiet economy of the cave giving way to the ordinary chaos of people remembering they had separate lives. They went up the 64 stairs in a long, slow column, one after another, blinking into the January light. Myron stood at the cave entrance and watched them go. Ruth Calloway, with her 3 children, the youngest, now healthy and loud and holding a piece of limestone she had carried up from the 3rd chamber as a souvenir. Mr. Marsh, moving slowly, stopping to look back at the entrance, once with an expression she would not forget. Beatrice Hicks, with her coat pockets full of something still not explaining. Tommy Greer went up near the end, both sacks empty, the cut above his eye already healed to a thin line. He stopped on the top step and turned back. "I'll make a map," he said, "a real one with measurements." "Agnes's ancestors already made a map," Marin said. "A different map, with both." He looked at the wall where the carved version was. Both maps should exist. Marin looked at him. 17 years old, standing in the entrance of a cave he had helped keep populated through a 3-week freeze offering to do something that no one had asked him to do. "Both maps should exist," she agreed. He went up. Voss was last except for Marin. He stood at the base of the stairs with his coat, which had been cleaned at some point in the past week by Nora without discussion, and looked around the main chamber. It was the look of a man who is committing something to memory because he knows he will not return. "The letter to Frankfurt," he said, "the mineral rights argument. I'm withdrawing it. Pruitt told me he already sent a counter-argument. I know. I'm withdrawing my position regardless." He turned to face her fully. "I want to be clear that this is not because I believe I was going to lose. I may have won." "I know," Marin said. "That's why it matters that you're withdrawing it." Something shifted in his face at that, something that was not comfort and was not guilt, but was the specific expression of a man being seen accurately and finding it both worse and better than he expected. The Harrison family, he has said, in 1839, I'm going to look into whether there's anything that can be done. Marin had not expected that. She let it sit for a moment without filling it with anything. Nora will know what needs doing. Yes, Voss said, she usually does. He went up the stairs. Marin stood alone in the main chamber for the last time with 34 people's worth of absence around her. The sleeping platforms empty. The cooking fire burned to coals, the stream still moving with its perpetual unhurried certainty. She went to the alcove. The clay vessel was still there, and the leather pouch beside it. She picked up the leather pouch carefully, the way you pick up something that has been waiting for someone to pick it up correctly. She carried it to where Agnes was sitting, which was in the chamber with the carved map, where Agnes always ended up when she had been in the cave for any length of time. Everyone's gone up, Marin said. Agnes was looking at the carved map on the wall. I know. Are you ready? Agnes did not answer immediately. She looked at the map for a long moment, her eyes moving along the lines her ancestors had made in the stone, the passages and chambers, in the 200-year-old notation of how cold the winter of 1780 had been and how many had survived it. My mother told me, Agnes said, that the people who built this place did not think of themselves as building for themselves. They built for the people who would come after them, the ones they would never know. She paused. That is a certain kind of faith, not the kind preached from a church, a different kind. The kind that holds without changing, Marin said. Agnes turned to look at her. Then she did something Marin had not seen her do before. She laughed. It was a short, dry sound, but it was genuine, and it changed her face into something that briefly showed the child she had been before 88 years of not being able to come home. Marin held out the leather pouch. Agnes took it with both hands and held it in her lap and looked at it for a long moment. Then she tucked it inside her coat close to her body, and Marin understood that it was going to stay there, that the 3-year-old girl it had belonged to was going to be carried from now on in the place where Agnes kept warm. I don't want to climb the stairs today, Agnes said. Marin looked at her. She was 93 years old. She had come down those stairs twice in the past month. Each time it had cost her something visible. Then don't, Marin said. I'll sleep here tonight. I've slept here before, long ago. I'll bring you food. I know you will. Agnes settled her back against the wall, her hand still pressed to the front of her coat where the pouch was. Go up. There are things that need doing above. Marin stayed a moment longer. Then she put her hand on Agnes's shoulder briefly and went up the 64 stairs into the January sun. There were indeed things that needed doing above. 3 weeks of frozen neglect had left marks on everything. The cabin needed wood, and the water barrel had cracked in the freeze, and the eastern fence was down in 2 places that needed fresh posts and new wire. She was working on the fence when Daniel appeared at the property line carrying a post hole digger and a length of new fencing timber, which meant he had gone home and assessed and come back, which meant he had planned to come back. They fixed the fence without much conversation, working in the easy rhythm of people who have spent 3 weeks in close quarters and have gotten past the part where they need to explain themselves to each other. The sun was low and the air was still cold, but the freeze-specific quality of the cold was gone. The part of it that felt intentional, as if the weather had given up its particular project and retreated to simply being winter. Edmund would have been glad the fence is fixed, Daniel said, working the post into the frozen ground. Edmund would have fixed it himself and not mentioned it to anyone. Yes. A pause. I know. Another pause longer. I'd like to keep helping, if that's acceptable. Marin looked at him over the fence post between them. He was not looking at her, focused on the work, which she had learned was how Daniel said things that mattered sideways and through the medium of whatever task was at hand. There's more fence, she said. There usually is. They kept working until the light went. She went down to Agnes that evening with bread and the last of the apple preserves Tommy had brought from behind the frozen falls and sat with her while she ate, and they talked quietly about things that were not urgent, about the summer, about what the cave would need before next winter, about a word Agnes used for the main chamber that translated to something like the holding place, which Marin thought was better than any name she would have given it. Agnes was tired in a way that was different from her usual tiredness, a deeper quality to it, a tiredness that seemed to come from the level of the bones rather than the muscles. Marin noticed and said nothing. She came back the next morning. Agnes was sitting against the wall of the carved map chamber with her hands still inside her coat, still holding the leather pouch, her eyes open and her face in an expression of such complete stillness that for a moment Marin thought she was simply in some very deep state of rest. She was not. Marin sat beside her for a long time in the warmth of the cave that had held people through more winters than anyone could count, with the carved record of those winters on the wall in front of them. And she did not move and did not speak and let the place be what it had always been, which was a place that kept its temperature regardless of what the weather was doing above. Then she went up and found Daniel at the cabin door and she said, "Agnes is gone." And he nodded and asked what she needed, and she said, "Help carrying stones," and they went back down together. They buried Agnes in the alcove off the carved map chamber, which was where she had indicated in the way Agnes indicated things, which was not by saying them directly, but by sitting in a spot long enough that you understood it was hers. They carried stones from the passage and built up a low cairn, and Daniel mortared the gaps with clay from the stream bank, which would last longer than anything they could have brought from above. Marin had brought a chisel. She had never done stonework in her life, but she had grown up watching her father work iron, and the principle was the same patience and repetition, and a willingness to accept that the material has its own preferences about how it will be shaped. She worked on a flat stone from the passage floor for most of an afternoon. What she carved was Agnes Morrow. She taught me to step below the winter. Daniel helped her set it at the head of the cairn. They stood back and looked at it in the lantern light. "It's the right thing to say," Daniel said. "It's the true thing," Marin said, which is the same thing when you're talking about someone like her. They went up. Above them, spring was beginning to think about arriving. The creek was fully open now, running with snow melt, and the first faint green was showing on the south-facing hillsides where the sun hit longest. Marin stood outside the root cellar and looked at 40 acres of rocky hillside and thought that Edmund had been right and wrong in a specific way. The land was poor. The land was also extraordinary. Both things were true, and both things had always been true, and the difference between surviving and not surviving had turned out to be knowing which truth to act on in which season. She kept the root cellar door latched but not locked. The court challenge was formally dismissed in March when Pruitt's letter arrived in Frankfurt, along with Voss's withdrawal and a signed statement from 17 members of the Hollow Creek community, including Tommy Greer, who wrote in his careful 17-year-old's handwriting that the cave under the Whitfield property had saved his life and the lives of 33 other people and was as much a part of that farm as the soil above it or the rain that fell on it. Voss sent no word directly to Marin, but in April she received a letter from an attorney in the county seat informing her that a discretionary fund had been established with the county court to assist families facing agricultural land disputes, funded by an anonymous donor, administered by the court with Reverend Pruitt as oversight trustee. Marin read the letter twice and then set it on the table and looked at it for a while. She wrote back to the attorney thanking the anonymous donor and indicating that she hoped the fund would be sufficient to revisit the matter of the Harrison family from 1839. She received no reply, but 6 months later she heard through the ordinary channels of a small community's information that the Harrison matter was being reviewed. Spring became summer. The cave stayed at its temperature unhurried, indifferent to the season, holding itself ready. Marin went down regularly, partly to maintain the things that needed maintaining, the cooking area. The stored provisions she rebuilt through the summer, the sleeping platforms, and partly because she had found that she thought more clearly underground that the particular quality of that air and that silence gave her access to something in herself that the surface with all its noise and weather did not. She was down there on a June morning checking the stream level when she heard footsteps on the stairs. 2 sets. One she recognized immediately as Daniel's, unhurried and measured. The other was lighter, smaller, faster. Their son Edmund came down the 64 stairs at a run, holding his lantern in both hands the way 4-year-olds hold things they consider precious, and burst into the main chamber with the specific energy of a child who has been told something wonderful is about to happen and cannot wait for it to start. He was named for his father's predecessor on this land, A man he would never know, a man whose most consequential act had been refusing to examine the stairs beneath the thing he thought he understood. Marin had thought a great deal about what name to give the boy, and had eventually concluded that the right one was the one that carried the most weight, because weight was not a burden if you knew how to carry it. Edmund Jr. at 4 years old was very good at carrying things. He ran to his mother and grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the eastern passage where Tommy Greer had marked the walls 6 months ago, and Daniel had mapped, and Marin had followed, and all of them had found the new chamber at the end, the one without carvings on the wall, the one that was simply stone and darkness and space. Papa says there's a new room, the boy said, past where Tommy's marks stop. I saw it. It goes deeper. Marin looked past him to Daniel, who had come down the stairs at a more reasonable pace and was now standing in the chamber entrance with his own lantern. He found it this morning, Daniel said. I was fixing the water diversion and he went ahead of me. I don't know how far it goes. Marin looked at her son, 4 years old, his mother's stubbornness, and his father Daniel's stillness, in the name of a man who had stood at the edge of something and not known to look down. He looked back at her with the absolute confidence of someone who has not yet learned to doubt that the next room will have something worth finding. She took his hand. They walked together through the eastern passage, past the second chamber, past Tommy's chalk marks at the edge of what had been the explored territory, into a section of cave that no one in any account Marin had ever heard had described. The passage narrowed, then widened, then turned, and the turn opened into a chamber unlike any she had seen. The walls here were almost entirely covered in limestone formations, columns and curtains, and structures built over millions of years by dripping water, filling the space in a way that left only narrow paths between them, a forest of stone, in a room that had been growing in the dark for longer than there had been anyone to see it. Edmund walked into it without hesitation, lantern held up, turning slowly, looking at everything with the pure attention of a child encountering something genuinely new. Marin stood at the edge and watched him. The formation nearest to her was perhaps 6 feet tall, built over thousands of years, from a single point on the ceiling, patient and accumulative, and completely indifferent to whether anyone ever saw it. It had been growing in the dark when Agnes's ancestors first built their fire pits in the main chamber above. It had been growing in the dark when Edmund Whitfield planted his root vegetables in the wrong part of the garden. It was still growing now, so slowly that no human lifetime could measure it, adding to itself drop by drop in the warm dark. Marin set her lantern down and reached into her coat. She had brought the chisel, not to carve anything in this chamber which felt wrong in the way of touching something that is not finished becoming itself. She had brought it for the passage wall outside the last blank section before the new chamber opened the place where Tommy's mark stopped and the unknown began. She went back to that section. She worked for perhaps 20 minutes, the chisel moving carefully, not in haste. What she carved was small, no larger than a handspan. A date, 3 figures, an arrow pointing deeper. It was not an ending. It was a notation, the same kind the people who built the fire pits had made on the wall of the upper chamber, the same impulse that had moved every hand that had ever pressed itself to the stone with a tool and said, we were here, we came this far, someone else will come further. She heard Edmund behind her coming back from the formation chamber, his boots on the stone. Mama, come look! She put the chisel in her pocket. She picked up her lantern. She turned and followed her son into the dark, where something she had not yet seen was already waiting. In the years that followed, the phrase Whitfield Stairs entered the common language of Hollow Creek, in the way that phrases do when they have been earned rather than invented, when they arise from a specific thing that happened and carry that thing inside them wherever they go. People used it the way they used other terms that had accumulated weight through use. When someone discovered value in a place that had been dismissed, when someone found depth where there had appeared to be only surface, when a situation that had seemed finished turned out to be only beginning. The old-timers would nod and say it with a particular quality of recognition that younger people found slightly mysterious, because you had to have been there or known someone who was to understand that the phrase was not a metaphor at all. It was a literal description of a literal thing that a literal woman had done on a cold November night when she had nothing left but the ground beneath her feet and was stubborn enough to find out what was under it. The cave is still there. The stairs are still there, worn smoother now by the generations that followed children's feet and old people's feet and everyone in between 64 steps down from a root cellar on a rocky hillside in a county that learned through one terrible winter that the land gives back to the people who understand it well enough to go deep. The temperature has not changed. Agnes Morrow's cairn is in the alcove off the carved map chamber, and the carving above it has been read by every person who has ever made it to that room, which is not everyone who has gone down the stairs, because the carved map chamber is not the first thing you find, and you have to want to go further. Most people do. The new chamber, the one with the limestone formations, does not have a name that anyone has agreed on. Different families call it different things. The children who found it first called it the forest, which has stuck the longest. And at the back of the forest chamber, past the tallest of the formations, there is a passage that even Tommy Greer did not map because it requires a lantern held at a specific angle and a willingness to follow a sound rather than a light, the sound of water moving somewhere deeper, further down, further in. No one knows where it goes. No one has gotten to the end of it. The earth is not something you finish. It is something you keep beginning.